Well, last time we talked about Branwen and the Great War against Ireland, when the Island of the Mighty defeated them so that there was not a man left standing. And we talked a little bit about what happened in the Odyssey when the head was cut off of Bran and they had 87 years of time on an island and on the peninsula of Wales. The third branch of the Mabinogion, or the third Mabinogi that we're going to talk about tonight, is called Manawydan, who was also present in the last branch. The way it starts is that Manawydan is surveying his position after the war and after the head of Bran has been buried in London. And he's in a tough position because he was not the oldest brother, so he doesn't have land. And his position is even tougher because his cousin Caswallon has usurped the throne. And if he's any too active for his own good, Caswallon would eliminate him. So he's distressed by his economic poverty and his political vulnerability. And he's talking with Pryderi, and Pryderi says, well, I've got 7 extra cantrevs that I can let you be the that you can be the ruler over them. You can even own them if you want. And you can marry my mother-in-law, or my mother, Rhiannon, who, as we remember, is from Anwen, the place of the dead. And Manawydan responds and says he doesn't care about wealth or ownership. He just wants to keep on living. He'll go along and he'll survey the situation. And so when they get back to David, Kigva and Rhiannon already have a feast planned for them. And during the course of the feast, Manawydan and Rhiannon hit it off splendidly. And so Manawydan accepts the offer of Pryderi, and Rhiannon accepts the offer of Manawydan, and so they're to be married. I think they're probably married at the same feast. At this juncture, Pryderi, though he is, as we know, a rather daring type of chap, is not foolhardy, and so he goes to Oxford, where Caswallon is holding court for the time, and he pledges his allegiance to Caswallon and the normal tribute from David. And when he returns, they start another cycle of feasting. And when they have finished the first part of the feast, the two couples, Pryderi and Kigva, and Manawydan and Rhiannon, climb to the top of Gorsedd Arbeth. You can sense what's coming already, more trouble. And when they sit at the top of Gorsedd Arbeth, a tremendous thunderstorm comes in, and a mist settles on them. And the mist is so thick that no one can see anyone else. They can talk to each other, but no one can see anyone else. And when the mist is lifted, every single human being except the 4 has disappeared. The whole kingdom or the whole province of David has been cleared of all human beings, and not only that, all domestic animals. So they try to go on as they are, living their royal life, but finally Manawydan says, we can't go on like this. We have to do something to stay alive. And so they go to England, and they settle in Hereford. and they decide to take up a trade and set up a saddle-making shop. And Manawyddan, being a master magician, knows how to work magic into his crafts, and he can bring blue coloring into the leatherwork of the saddles, and they're magnificent saddles. And soon, nobody wants any other saddles but the saddles that come from their saddle shop. Of course, the other saddle makers don't like this, and they fear starvation, and they set up a conspiracy to kill the 4 strangers. Manawyddan gets wind of it, and he says, we better go. Pryderi says, no, let's stay here and fight. We can handle them. But he's that sort of chap. And but eventually Manawyddan talks sense to him, and they leave, and they go to another town. And instead of taking up saddle making, they make shields instead. Set up a little armory. And what happens is the same thing. They make shields that are so spectacular that everybody wants one of their shields and claims that nothing else will they have. And again, another conspiracy is set up between the town shield makers, and they have to flee again. And finally, they go to a third town, and they take up shoemaking. And they know how to incorporate gold work and gold buckles into their shoes, and they become the rage, and everybody wants their shoes, and the same thing happens again. At this point, they decide enough is enough, and they go back to David. They go back to Arbeth in David, and they decide to live by hunting. And so they catch some dogs and train them, and they go out hunting. And one day, when they're out hunting, the dogs run into this copse, and they come back, tails between their legs, shivering in fear. And so they decide to approach the copse and see what's going on. And when they do so, a white boar comes running out of the copse, and they chase it, and the dogs chase it, and the boar runs right into an extremely tall fortress or castle that has never been there before. Yeah, this is a very strange happening. The next one gets even stranger than this. And the hounds chase the boar into the fortress, and suddenly they become silent. No sound of hounds anywhere. Pryderi, being very bold and daring like his father Pwyll, says, I'm going in there and see what's happening. Manawyddan advises him against him and says, this is obviously enchantment, and you better be careful. And Pryderi says, I don't care, I'm going in anyway. And when he gets inside, he sees a slab, and above the slab is a golden cauldron. And the golden cauldron is suspended by 4 chains that go so far up that their end, if there is an end, is out of sight. And he's so fascinated by the beauty of the cauldron that he reaches over to grab it, and his hands stick to the cauldron, and his feet stick to the slab, and he is muted. He loses all control of hhis voice. He becomes speechless. Manawyddan doesn't want to enter. He knows better, so he hangs around and hangs around and hangs around until it's evening time, and he returns to Arbeth. And Rhiannon says, where's my son? Where's Pryderi? And Manawyddan tells her what happened, and Rhiannon rebukes him and says, what kind of friend are you? Why didn't you go to his rescue? And so Rhiannon goes running to where the fortress is, and she sees the same thing, and she grabs a hold of the cauldron, and she's stuck to the cauldron, and her feet are stuck, and her voice is silenced. And at this point, a mist settles over the fortress, and when the mist lifts, the fortress and all of its contents have disappeared. It's a complete enchantment. And Manawyddan then is alone, and he goes back to the courtyard at Arbeth, and he tells Kigva what has happened, and he said, I'll look after you, I'll take care of you, and I'll be honorable, and I won't violate you or friendship or anything like that, but I think we're going to have to go and make a living for ourselves. So they go back to England again. Note, there is a distinction here between Britain and England. Britain belongs to the Celts, and England belongs to those Anglo-Saxon Germans. So they go to England, and they settle in a town, and Manawyddan says, all right, I'll be a shoemaker again. And the result is the same. Great shoes, but a lot of prosperity, but also a lot of violent enemies. And so they have to pack up and leave. Only this time it doesn't take 3 replications to learn what is gone, that this isn't going to work. They leave immediately. And what Manawyddan does is, with the proceeds from their shoemaking business, he buys wheat. And he decides to go back to David and do something that he loves the very best, and that is to be a farmer. And so he plants 3 fields of wheat. I don't know how he gets them tilled without horses, but he does it. And when they begin to ripen, he goes out to the first field to see whether it's ready for harvest. And when he gets there, the wheat stalks are bare. All of the grains have been clipped off of them. And he then walks over to the second field and looks at it, and it looks pretty good. He says, tomorrow I'll harvest this one. He comes back the next day, and that one is clipped bare. All these stalks, no grains on the top. And so what happens is he walks over to the third field, and he sees it's all right, and he says, I'm going to find out, no matter what's going on. So he makes himself a little campfire, and he sits on the edge of the field. And around midnight, he hears a large uproar, and he sees this multitude of mice come running in, and there are as many mice as there are stalks in the field. And the mice crawl up the stalks, and then they nip off the grains on the top, and then they take off. And he's outraged. He's all shook up by this, and he tries to chase mice, but there are so many of them, and they're moving so many directions that he is dazed by their chaotic movements. He's just totally startled by it, and he can't catch any, but at last he sees this one heavier mouse that is slower, and he grabs it. And he puts, it's really quite a story. It's actually quite a beautiful story. He puts it in his glove, and he takes a string, and he seals it into his glove with a string. He gets back to the hall at Arbeth, and he tells Kigva the story of how he caught this one slow mouse. And he's adamant, and he says, I'm going to hang it, because that is the punishment for thieves. He said, I'd like to hang them all, but I only caught one, so one is all I'm going to hang. And she's aghast, and she tells him, that's beneath your dignity. And he says, shame on me if I don't hang this one. And he has every intent to do so. And Kigva just says, all right, he's stubborn, I can't do anything with him. And so Manawydan sets out for, where else? Gorsid Arbeth. Yeah. And when he gets to the top, he takes 2 forked sticks and he puts them in the ground as the beginning of a rudimentary gallows. And as he's doing so, this ragged scholar approaches and bids him good day. And Manawydan says, where do you come from? He says, England, why do you ask? And Manawydan says, well, there haven't been any human inhabitants here for 7 years. And the scholar asks him, what are you doing? And he says, I'm hanging a thief. And the scholar says, all I see is a mouse. And he says, it's not fitting for a man of your dignity, because he's wearing royal clothing, to do something like that. And Manawydan says, I caught it, and I will execute the punishment for stealing, which is hanging. The scholar says, well, I'll give you a whole pound if you release it. And Manawydan says, I will neither sell it nor release it. And he's really bent on his task, so the scholar leaves. So Manawydan puts a cross piece on the 2 forked sticks, and as he's fastening it, a priest comes walking by, and they have almost identical conversation, except that the priest offers him 3 pounds, which is an enormous sum for a mouse, but Manawydan again refuses. And he gets to the point where he's tying the noose around the mouse's neck, and he's pulling it tight, ready to hang it from the gallows. And a bishop comes by. And the bishop has almost the same identical conversation with him, only he offers 24 pounds. And Manawydan again refuses. And the bishop says, look out over this plain. And Manawydan does, and there are all kinds of horses and domestic animals out there which he hasn't seen for 7 years. And the bishop says, free the mouse, and I'll give you all of these animals. And Manawydan says, no. And the bishop says, name your price. And Manawydan says, I want the return of Pryderi and of Rhiannon, and I want the removal of the entire enchantment of David. The bishop says, okay. Manawydan is curious at this point, and he says, who is she? And he's meaning the mouse. And the bishop tells him, she's my wife. And Manawydan doesn't blink an eye at this. He continues querying him, and the bishop says he's really Lloyd, the son of Kilcoed. And Kilcoed happened to be a friend of Gawal. If you remember Gawal from 2 stories ago, the one that tricked Pwyll out of Rhiannon as his wife, and later was retricked by Rhiannon, and then they played that game of badger in the bag, where they put him in the bag of imagination and tied it shut, and as the men came in, everybody beat it or prodded it or something like that. And Lloyd says he's revenging Gawal because he was not sworn to not revenge, as Gawal was himself. And he tells how the first 2 nights, all the men of Anwen came and were changed into mice, but on the 3rd night, the women wanted to get into the action, and so they were changed into mice, but his wife was pregnant, and so she was fat and slow, and she couldn't keep up when it was time to escape. And the bishop says, well, I've given you your price, now release them. And Manawyddan says, not so quickly, he says. He says, not until there is a promise that there will be no more spells and no more vengeance between Anwin and the kingdom of David. And the bishop says, you shall have that. And then Manawyddan sees them starting to come back. And so what he does is releases the mouse, and the bishop pulls out a wand, and he touches the mouse, and it turns out to be a beautiful but very pregnant woman. And he asks one last question before they part, and he says, were Rhiannon and Pryderi imprisoned? And the bishop tells him yes. Pryderi had gate hammers hanging around his head, and Rhiannon had to wear the hay collars that asses have. This is the second time that Rhiannon in these stories has had it bad. And so that's the ending of the story of Manawyddan, which is sometimes called in the Mabinogi of the hay collars and gate hammers rather than the Mabinogi of Manawyddan. Now for 6 hours of denouement. No, it's going to be short. It's very short. It's not plentiful. All processes or all process of any kind in the cosmos can be seen in terms of a three-stage cycle. The stages of the cycle are not even. The most fundamental stage of the cycle lasts the longest amount of time. And in that stage, whatever it is that is in that cycle has a slow, ongoing, functional process, and it accomplishes. The second stage of the cycle is short, and it is marked by radical change. And the radical change is usually violent. And the third stage of the cycle is quiescence. Everything goes to a very calm, peaceful, almost inactive state. And then it starts all over again. This, for example, is the cycle with cell division. A cell functions, carries on its cellular activities, and then suddenly on an impulse from the nucleus, there's a violent activity and it rips in two, and then after that, the third stage is both new cells are very, very quiescent. And then after a while, they start functioning again. In fact, this is so true that it is even the same with collective cell division. Like little babies do not grow at a continuous rate. Little babies grow in spurts. There's a suddenly there you can almost see them grow before your eyes, and then there's a quiescent period, and they're living at that state. This also continues, or this same cycle is seen in geoevolutionary process. The world goes on, and all of the wars of the elements and erosion and tidal forces and things like that carry on. And animals do their work and gradually go through their species activities. And then there is a violent cataclysmic event, which usually is accompanied by wiping out a lot of species, and then everything is quiet. And those that survive are often mutant, or they have the qualities that can carry on in the next era, and they go forward like that. Same kind of trinary cycle. It happens in stellar process with supernovae, things like that. And it also applies to history. There are periods in societies and for the world at large where there is ongoing development. And then there is war. And after the war is over, there is a quiescence and a surrender. Churchill was intuitively aware of this, though I don't know that he understood the cycle as recorded by mystics, with regard to World War II. Had we listened to him, the Cold War would not have been so severe. He wanted to liberate, or he wanted to re-liberate what he called the soft underbelly of Europe. And he said if we re-liberate it, we can perhaps keep it from communism. So Manawydan is aware of this, and he knows he has to keep that quiescence and not challenge Caswallon, or it might be his end. Last time, when we looked at the cauldron of regeneration that passed back and forth from Ireland to the island of the mighty and then back to Ireland again, we saw the whole war as a war of regeneration that takes place in ourselves. We talked about solar germs and impulses coming from the cranium down the spine to the area of the sacrum where they are regenerated, and if we have positive thoughts, we can bring them all the way back up into the cranium. We said last time that it wasn't quite successful because Branwen was never brought back to the island of the mighty. All in this process, the source of sin had to be wiped out, and the germ had to be turned into something completely positive before it could really be brought into the citadel of consciousness without resulting in the most horrible kind of black magic. For Manawydan, it wasn't a matter of political survival only. He recognized that was true. It was a deliberate choice. He realized that the pride on both the side of the Irish and the people of Wales was what was the source of the downfall, and he deliberately chooses a quiet, humble kind of life, and realizes that that's necessary for a regeneration away from or free of egoism. At this stage in the cycle, in the quiescence, we would certainly expect strange things to happen. And since this is obviously much more than a political, material world war, we'd also expect something to happen. And it happens simultaneously with another war, the war of the elements. Next year we're going to go into Shakespeare, and when we go into The Tempest, we're going to see that all sorts of wonders occur at those times of extremely low pressure. At the times of extremely low pressure, there is a very thin and sometimes non-existent membrane between the physical and the etheric worlds. When water spouts form, when tornadoes form, there are all sorts of things that happen that verge on the miraculous. If you read the reports of people who have witnessed a tornado from close up, and you read the reports of somebody who's on the early stages of etheric clairvoyance, they both report seeing a green or yellow-green haze in the atmosphere as they're passing their consciousness into that higher trend. So it's not surprising that a magic would occur in the middle of a tempest. And in this case, it is a big magic. Because if all the inhabitants, it's one thing to make one object disappear, but if all the inhabitants of an entire kingdom disappear, including the domestic animals, that means this is something on the scale, on a cosmic scale. And we're talking about the level of gods. So, the only ones that are left are the four royals, who in one sense represent the candidate for initiation. Royal people and heroes always are represented like that. Only in this case, they're left without support. In our lives, if we're trying to grow spiritually, there is always a time that we have to become more completely self-reliant. And we have to become utterly dependent upon the Spirit. Usually it happens when the world abandons us or is treacherous to us. We can't rely anymore on the material world for our source of faith, our source of security. We lose that. Some people call this stage walking through the valley of the shadow of death. To make the point, in this story, all human support, all worldly support completely disappears. If it's a real spiritual growth, it is a matter, it's not playing around, it's for real. And if it's for real, and you're not fully developed, you're not fully awakened, what happens is you cast around a bit. And this casting around is always represented in some kind of a journey or an odyssey of some kind or another. It's a soul trip to find out what's going on. And in a way that's necessary because we have to acquaint ourselves with our new life, our new world that we live in. And so it's not surprising that they do take a trip to see what they can do to continue at least their ongoing. It's a really good thing that they do bring self-reliance, and that even though they were royals, and like parasites, which we've said before, the parasite is a divine state, like the mistletoe is a parasite in the plant kingdom, but it's the first plant to have a desire body, like the animal kingdom. And so it sacrifices roots, which are the connection to the group spirit. Similarly, the initiate or the poet or the mystic or somebody like that is like a parasite because they have given up contact to some extent with the material world in order to be in closer touch with the spiritual world. But in this case, it's a good thing that they do have self-reliance and they take up a trade. It is not good that they try to accommodate themselves. You can't go back to the old ways because the old ways represent sort of the enemy. And this is why they had to go to England, because to the Britons, Tim tells me that in Wales there are still some people that speak only Welsh and they won't speak to you in English. That they carry that sort of attitude on and on and on. The world fights back. And it fights back for several reasons. It doesn't want to be changed. The material world and the worldly life is ruled by Saturn, and it negates change. It wants to go on in inertia. And it doesn't want to be wowed by magical talent. There are those stories like one brother becoming a magician and the other brother becoming a merchant, and they meet each other after many years, and the magician says, "See, I can walk across the water to the other side." And the other brother says to him, "Is that all you learned in these many years?" And he says, "I just have to give a small coin, which is just a small amount of my effort, and the ferryman will take me across." And that's the thinking of the material world. There's another reason. When we set out to live a higher life and to live the life of the Spirit, and we start to make headway, what happens is the world wants us to succeed. And it won't let us get away with anything. It won't let us fall back in the least. People don't, absolute strangers that you've never seen before in your life, if you deviate from your committed living, if you deviate it, they will push you back in, and they might not even know why they're doing it, because they really want to help. Apparently, our foursome is slow to get the message. It takes 3 tries before they get it through their head that they can't do this. Pruderi is even willing to resort to violence, which indicates an even greater regression. And they follow that attempt. They try to go back to David and become hunters. And they want to live as being predators, and they want to live off the chase. Then comes that incident of the enchanted castle. If we try to revert too far, miracles are given to us. Miracles don't come to strong spiritual students. Miracles and visions come to the weaklings. It's because they're so weak they need that to set them back on the path again. For most people, we develop more of a love of God, and that's what impels us on. And we don't need all of those other things. When we come to this mystical or magical event of the enchanted fortress or the enchanted castle, we have to go back to Hermetic sealing. Hermetic sealing said in the process of alchemy was when you knew all of the ingredients that were necessary to turn base metal into gold, you sealed them in, and they did their work relative to each other. Hermetic sealing is like saying that you listen to no one but the muse from within, and you fight it out within yourself until you make the breakthrough. This means that a story like the story we're looking at is like a hermetically sealed capsule, and that everyone in the story represents something in the retort, and we are the retort. And this means that Pruderi represents one part of our being, Manawidden represents another part, and Ryanan yet another part. It's just like a dream. It's an enclosed capsule. That everything in the dream or in the story is in us, and it's some facet of our own being. It's always wise to remember that, because otherwise there's the tendency to project, and to project as if someone outside of us were the source of our problems, and then someone outside of us had to be the source of our salvation. So, this kind of thinking clarifies the image of what we're looking at. What one might say is that the story, or the Mabinogi of Manawyddan, is something of a collective composite of the two that preceded it. In the first one, Puil, we have the active hero who goes back and forth between two worlds. A bride passes back and forth between two potential husbands and also between two worlds. That is Rhiannon. And from the story of Branwen, we have some kind of magical cauldron, which we saw last time had a number of meanings. On one hand, it represented the sacrum area. It represented the receptivity when the involutionary stream of a spiritual impulse was transformed into an experience so that it could become evolutionary and become expressed outwardly in some magical form or format. We'll continue along that same kind of thinking. As we are standing right now in the story at the enchanted fortress, Pryderi represents the worldly, brave warrior reaching for the divine. He's a very personal figure. Rhiannon represents the divine, otherworldly bride mother, the inspirer, the guider, the protecting force. Relative to the material world, she is seen as a spiritual individuality figure, just as Pryderi is a material, personal figure. Manawyddan, on the other hand, represents that of us, which is sort of a benign, silent watcher. A watcher that is reluctant to do everything by action and is cautious about preemptive commitment until it can be done with conviction. I have a question about the way the story is laid out. The version that we have, which is from the Red Book of Hergest, says there are 4 chains on the cauldron. It doesn't make sense to me, except if it is seen in a different way. If we have the cauldron and put 3 chains on it, and have them stretch off into infinity, we then have a very classical image. I didn't put the connections on to form a tetrahedron because that would say that that would make it a closed object. Things of the spirit are open-ended. The 3 chains carrying off into eternity represent the attributes of the spirit as connected in the self. Remember last time we talked about that goblet? The goblet that is like the voice box and the cranium, where the divine selfhood as an imaginative being forms a receptacle, and the truth that is pure light comes as intuitive drippings into that cauldron, into that grail cup. And that is what it would be if there were 3 chains on it. The cauldron would then represent the true self as a receptor of divine impulse. And if you like, you can even look at it as a lens that projects into the phenomenal worlds. This whole idea of a self is then a very divine being. When Pryderi grabs the cauldron and he's stuck to the slab, That's almost like saying this is the image of someone rooted in the earth, but reaching up to the divine spiritual being. Even stories and myths have to have their limitation, because I think if this image were taken in its fullest sense, Rhiannon would be seen on a slab, but inverted, reaching down to the cauldron. And Pryderi would then be from a four-sided pyramid, very poor pyramid, representing the four material states versus Rhiannon with the three spiritual attributes. And that to me is a more reasonable image. In fact, it's a very, very, but you can't say that Rhiannon got inverted and, it wouldn't make much of a story. It would be just too far out. So she represents the spiritual individuality reaching down through the self to the personality, and the personality is reaching upward to the spirit to grow. And there is a wedding and there is a union. They're only touching, they're not interpenetrating. So it is at a stage of evolution that they're only touching. It's not like the image that we saw years ago when we looked into the hero myth of Siegfried. When Siegfried meets Brunhilde at the top of the mountain, he kisses her and she awakens. Meaning to say that the consciousness reaches upward and awakens in the highest sense a self-consciousness in a momentary kiss. This is a much different image. The two are bound through the self. The two are bound together, and they are held together in a way that is inseparable. And it is a connection that's going to last on and on and on. The process, however, from the viewpoint of the individual, if we look at the judicial Manawydan, the whole process of the four being left alone is now carried a step further. Because both Pryderi, representing the very earthly, somebody who is brave, daring, willing to take on anything, that's the kind of person that becomes an initiate, and Rhiannon, with her birds of intuition, representing the spirit, they have also disappeared. All we have now is this silent watcher, Manawydan as an adjudicator. So the daring is gone, and the birds of Rhiannon are gone, and it represents a stage where we have to go on without the inspiration of the Spirit, and we have to go on without the push of instinct, without the human desires, and without the divine impulse to creativity. Our faith has to be founded, our self-reliance has to be founded in ourselves, so that we're willing to do the right thing without the Spirit being there to give us immediate glorious feedback, and without the world there having to give us support or applause or whatever. We have to be thrust back on our own judgment. Good, sound judgment. If we have that bag of the imagination that can hold anything in it, the only way that we can use that is if we have the judgment. If we could see an atom or a solar system, the only way we can make use of that kind of an instrument is by good judgment, so that we do what is relevant to our circumstance. Now, this is self-reliance, as pure as it gets, without any support, without any embellishment of any kind. Manawyddan will not revert to dishonor. He tells that to Kigva. But he does momentarily try to go back to the world. Again, it's positive in that it shows his humility, and it shows his willingness to participate. But it is not positive because it means going back to materialism, symbolized by England in this case. This time it only takes one experience. And when he does come back to David, he does what he loves the best. The meaning of seeds has always been used by mystical myth interpreters going back to the Platonists as the planting of good thoughts and reaping in them service. It isn't just a matter in the spiritual life of realizing the truth. It isn't a matter of unfolding the glories of our divine nature. It is a matter that the Spirit must grow. It must be fed, and it must be fed by experience. And the experience that is soul material is what is always represented by grains. It represents harvested experience. The most efficient kind of experience is that which is service. Service meaning a free choosing to work with the intent, to work with the plan of creation. It is like we are serving what is going on and the author of what is going on. That's the most efficient kind of experience. If we can learn the things that we need to learn and give to the creative process in harmony with the divine intent behind it, that is the best kind of service. So grains represent something like germs, creative kernels, out of which things develop. They're like essential ideas or thoughts that grow into something. And they take time. You know, the spiritual life is not something that's going to be instantaneous. It's something that is very, very slow. Things have to grow, and they have to develop, and they have to mature, and they have to ripen, and then we can reap them. However, sometimes we, like Manawyddan, never do reap what we sow. Something else gets there before we do. I am not sure that I know of any mythical use of symbolism that indicates mice in this form. So this is speculation at this point. It has no reinforcement from that, anything that has been done by any other that I know of. But when I think about the mice, only one thing comes to mind, and no matter how I try to think about the mice, one thing and only one thing comes to mind. Bad thoughts. No matter what kind of good intentions we have, no matter what kind of good deeds we can do, bad thoughts can gobble up almost every opportunity that is put before us unless we control our minds. it isn't surprising that Manawyddan would be amazed and confounded or befuddled, because actually in our minds it's like that. To some extent, before we work on clarifying our consciousness and getting control of our mind, our whole consciousness is a maelstrom of contradictions. We just have one thing contradicting another, another, and another. We believe they're all true because we thought them. Sounds just like the mice stealing it all away from us. And I think that whole idea of that kind of befuddlement is a perfect image for the undisciplined mind. Something comes and gobbles up. We may even have a valid thought. And we may be ready to reap that valid thought. Before you know it, some bad thought comes along and distracts us, or, you know what I'm trying to say? We not even conscious of the fact that we're thinking bad thoughts. And we lose it. It is imperative that we gain control of our mind. That we can take one thought and stay with it and slow it down even to the point where it is stopped, and so that we can take it and put it out there and look at it, so to speak. Turn it around and look at it from every perspective before we can do anything with our consciousness. We have to control the mind. The Welsh, as we have seen, have a great fondness for singularities. When Will dispatches Havgen, he does it with one stroke, no more. They love single important issues, and they love getting at that one central germ. So Manawyddan only catches one mouse. Like thought, it is pregnant. But he makes the best of that very simple opportunity. When he tells Kigbush, he appeals to his pride. But you can't get to him because he's a humble man. He knows he's sticking to his purpose. He's not going to lose the one thing that he's caught. So he uses those very reproving words that we saw last time in Branwen, when they had been 80 years in that hall, feasting and talking to the head of Bran. The man says, "Shame on me if I don't do this thing, unless I actually try the Spirit, unless I actually test this out to see the truth in it. Shame on me." And shame in this sense is a very powerful word. Shame means that one is being shaken right to the core of the central being. When someone is shamed, it is the harshest kind of delivery you can make to the self or to the individual. So he's saying, essentially what I am is no good unless I do something about this. Clearly it's not vengeance against the mouse. You can't even be angry with your own bad thoughts, because that's just another distraction. It's something more like the execution of an analysis. To break something down to get to the root of it. If we can catch one thought, even a bad thought, and follow it back to its source, we can turn that source into something positive. And if we can do it with one, we can do it with any, and eventually with all. That's one of the dazing things about bad thoughts. You say, there's so many, how am I ever going to do this? But if you take one at a time, the very process of being able to execute an analysis of one thought and take it back to its root, back to its source, you can get right back to the source of truth of everything. And that exercise in itself takes care of quite a few of the problems of the mind. If you can concentrate just one time, that's enough. There's more to it, to the mice, than that. And we'll go into some classic study of mythology. About 8 years ago, we were talking about Orpheus. And we said that Orpheus was a follower not only of the light and the purity, but he was a follower of Apollo. And at that time we talked about Apollo Smintheus, the mouse god and the blacksmith god. In fact, the word smith and the name Smith go back to Apollo Smintheus. The adherents of this cult revered the strength of the mouse in its tiny, humble obscurity. They found a strength that couldn't be found in gigantic might. This theme of hanging gods, or hanging by the gods, or being hung as a representative of the god, or hung in effigy as a representative of the god, is a very common theme to the initiate cycle. It was part of the festival of Beltane that we talked about before. For example, Wotan in German mythology used to sometimes be called Wotan of the gallows. In Greece, it was prevalent in all cults of Apollo, including the cult of Apollo Smintheus. In the famous music contest, one version of it has not Pan, but the representative of Pan in Marsyas, who plays the flute and has the musical contest with Apollo. And when he loses, he is hung as a sacrificial animal. In all cases where the god was hanged, or the initiate was hanged, or the sacrificial animal was hanged, it was always flayed. And eventually just the skin was hung from the tree. In some cases, the skins were worn by priests. And in those cases, they were meant as vehicles for the transference of energy. When there is a transference of energy from the dead to the living, there's a name for that. It's called regeneration. Sound familiar? It's what we've been talking about all year. So we have in the hanging of the mouse the emblem that was universal in the ancient world, in sun cults, in Apollo cults, for regeneration. The serpent that Apollo Pythias struggled with for a year shed its skin and was regenerated in a new form. So the hanging of the mouse represents death by and for analysis, so that the experience of that life can be extracted and fed to the soul, or fed to the spirit through the soul, or as soul. It's again getting back to a geminal idea. So we have the whole idea, again, as we did in Branwen, brought forth in another way, in a sacrificial way, and in a very concrete way of what we have to do to attain to it. It's not just enough to break the cauldron of sin. It is that we have to take all of those bad thoughts and we have to transform them They have to be something that are in our control. Then and only then can we execute them, and then and only then can we draw the essence out as soul material. The closer we get to the truth, the deeper we can go in as we go closer and closer and closer to the Spirit, the more difficult it is to maintain perseverance. The illusions, the effects, the forms, the expressions become more and more glamorous, and they become more and more spectacular. The price keeps going up. And it's easy to settle for a grandiose illusion. Even people who can do magic don't necessarily make it to the truth. They make it partway there, and they settle for the illusion. It means that we have to persevere all the way. Manawydden does persevere. He doesn't counter magically. He doesn't fight fire with fire. He doesn't seek for himself. He wants truth. He wants justice. And he represents that kind of judgment that without heaven or earth is going to do the right thing anyway. So, he keeps his mind on the goal and allows nothing to deter him. He never blinks. And that's what we have to do to come to the truth. Tough, really tough. In regard to this, the Zen Buddhists have a statement that says, first you see sky and mountains and streams, and then you see almost everything but sky and mountains and streams. And then you see sky and mountains and streams. Meaning to say that at first we don't see that there's anything behind things. We don't even probably see what is before our eyes. But then as we try to penetrate deeper into things, we see all kinds of meaning. We see that meaning to the detriment of the objects. But eventually, when we get the whole thing, we see the sky, the mountain, and the streams again, and integral within that is the truth, that we see the whole and what is within it at the same time. Manawydden doesn't want something fantastic or glamorous. What he wants is things as they really are. It's so easy to flatter ourselves with wonders. It's so easy to see things that we want to see, or see things that are pleasant to see and not what is at all. In this regard, we can quote that famous Zen Buddhist James Brown. He says, the way it is the way I like it best. Really true, very true Zen statement about the nature of reality. At this point, I'm not prepared to speak about Lloyd and the whole idea of vengeance from Onwen. It's something that I don't have the capacity to go into at this point. Vengeance or no, it does seem to me that we are responsible for what we do on other levels, in other forms of existence, and that we will have retributive experiences from what we've done. That makes sense to me. But exactly what this is pointing to, whether this is pointing to some kind of war in heaven that does precipitate down into this plane, it is a possibility, but it isn't clear enough, and this story isn't quite the vehicle that I was able to get to that through. At any rate, when we set out on a positive life, we have to be positive about everything. There is no regeneration in negativity. Bad thoughts are not bad because they're bad thoughts. They're bad thoughts because they're negative. And they are restraining or killing of the seeds of life. So it seems sensible that our positivity has to be thoroughgoing, and that there probably is a horizontal and a vertical cause and consequence. In this matter, it's clear that Manawydan shows tremendous growth as a impartial judge. He covers all the logical cases. See, and that's again a recapitulation from the past experiences of Koepsel. He knows what he wants. He wants reality. He wants justice, and he'll settle for nothing else. But he also, from all of this, knows what he doesn't want. And he seals off the negative possibilities of reversion back into those same forms of negativity, of destruction, of bad thoughts. So there's a great deal of growth that has taken place from Pwyll through Bran and then into Manawydan. It's this kind of awareness where we recognize, almost like Parmenides in the famous dialogue by Plato, where it covers all of the positives and all the negatives and all the positive positives and all the negative positives and all the positive negatives and all the negative negatives. All cases are covered. It's a total kind of judgment. All of Aristotelian logic developed out of that dialogue of Parmenides. And it is a total, fundamental kind of judgment. It's clear that the good, as seen in the eyes of Manawydan, even though he was capable of magic, is a matter of logical judgment. And it's something that can be executed impersonally, and it can be executed with full humility, but it makes sure that there is no backsliding, no going back to something before. I think the story of Manawydan, in terms of spiritual growth, it means nothing else. It means persistence. When once we know what we want, we never let anything deter us, and we persist. Next time we'll talk about math, and the stories get even wilder in that one. All magic next time. Thank you guys very much.
So really what the story is doing is turning the original Saturn aspect back in upon itself, so that what was hard to fight at the beginning in terms of the materialism and the attraction of that, he fights through, but learns the real perseverance of Saturn, so that he can
Perseverance,
single-mindedly on the goal.
Perseverance and concentration. That's going to carry into the next one too. Concentration. That's where that love of singularities come. That may even be why the temperament of the Welsh, with their love of singularities, is what it is, because there is something that's about Saturn that can be negative. And even in modern times, the Welsh scholars are negative about themselves and what they do with their own work. Thank you, guys.